The first convoy left Ridgemont on a Tuesday. I know because I was standing in my front yard with wet concrete on my boots, watching a line of headlights stretch down Route 9 like a lit fuse burning south. Pickup trucks loaded past their axle ratings, sedans with mattresses strapped to roofs, a school bus with no markings, windows dark, moving at 40 miles an hour with no children inside. I didn't join them. I had 16 bags of Quikrete, a rented cement mixer I was never going to return, and a hole in my backyard that was already 9 feet deep. My name is Corey Brandt. I'm 41 years old. I poured my first foundation when I was 19, framing crew for Deschler and Sons out of Billings. I've worked concrete for 22 years, residential mostly, basement slabs, retaining walls, the kind of work that wrecks your knees and your marriage in roughly the same decade. Karen left in 2021 and took her last name back. My brother Dean took her side because Dean always took the side that cost him the least. I got the house, 3 acres of hard-packed clay outside Ridgemont, Montana, with a well that pulls clean water from 60 feet. The land was the one thing the divorce didn't touch because Karen never wanted it. She said it felt like living on the moon. Turns out the moon has its advantages. The infection had been on the news for 11 days by then. They were still calling it Gaines syndrome in the first week, after the CDC researcher who classified the initial cluster in Baton Rouge. By day 8, nobody used the clinical name anymore. The footage out of Memphis made clinical language feel like describing a house fire with a thermometer. People were dying in a way that didn't stay done, and the dead were walking toward the living with a mechanical focus that no one on television could explain without their hands shaking. I didn't panic. I want to be clear about that, not because it makes me brave, but because it's important to understand what I did next and why. I wasn't calm out of courage. I was calm because I'd been thinking about a hole in my backyard for 3 years, not for zombies, for everything else. Montana gets ice storms that kill power for 2 weeks. Wildfire smoke in August you can taste in your basement. I'd been pricing corrugated steel culvert pipe since 2022, sketching layouts on graph paper at the kitchen table while eating dinner alone. The infection just took a project I'd been circling for 3 years and removed the last excuse not to start. So on the Tuesday the first convoy left, I was already on day 2 of digging. My neighbor, Gary Oberlin, walked over that morning while I was running the mini excavator I'd rented from Bridger Equipment the week before. Gary is 67, retired game warden. He stood at the edge of the pit and looked down at me and said, "You building a swimming pool or a grave?" "Shelter," I said. "From what?" I pointed toward Route 9 without looking up. Another cluster of vehicles was passing, moving faster now. Someone honked at nothing. Gary watched them for a while, then looked back at me. "How deep you going?" 12 feet, then lateral. "You need help?" "I need you to go to Bridger Equipment before they close and buy every bag of anchoring cement they have left. They won't deliver anymore." Gary didn't ask questions. That's the thing about Gary. He spent 30 years in the field watching animals do exactly what their instincts told them. And he extended the same courtesy to people. He drove his truck to town and came back 3 hours later with 34 bags of cement and the news that Bridger Equipment had been cleaned out 15 minutes after he left. He also brought the information that the National Guard had set up a checkpoint on I-90 westbound, and that the grocery store on Main had a line wrapped around the building. "You're not leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. "No." "My daughter's in Missoula. She wants me to come." "You should go." He looked at the pit. He looked at the bags of cement stacked on my driveway. He looked at me, standing in Montana clay up to my shins with a shovel in my hands, and absolutely no intention of getting in a car. "I'll stay through the weekend," he said. "Help you pour." That was the first deal I made. It would not be the last, and it would not be the worst. By Thursday, the hole was 12 feet deep, and I'd started cutting laterally into the hillside behind my property. The design was simple because simple is what you can build fast with 2 men and a cement mixer. A main corridor 8 feet wide, 14 feet long. A sleeping chamber off the left side, 10 by 10. A storage room off the right, same dimensions. 1 entrance. A vertical shaft with a steel ladder, topped by a hatch I was fabricating from 1/4-inch plate steel I'd pulled off a decommissioned grain bin on the Caldwell property 2 miles north. Ed Caldwell had already evacuated. I didn't ask permission because there was no one to ask. Gary worked without complaint. He hauled bags, mixed concrete, held rebar in position while I wired it. We worked 17-hour days. At night, we ate canned food in my kitchen and listened to the radio until the station started going off the air. One by one, like lights in a hallway switching off from the far end. On Thursday night, the emergency broadcast system played a message I'd already heard 6 times. "Shelter in place, await military assistance. Do not approach individuals displaying signs of Gaines syndrome." Then it played a new one. The governor was ordering a mandatory evacuation of all communities west of the Continental Divide, with populations under 10,000. Ridgemont had 4,000 people. We were on the list. "Mandatory," Gary said, chewing a cracker. "They can't enforce it. They don't have the manpower. They've got the Guard on I-90. The Guard on I-90 has their own problems." He looked at me over his reading glasses. "Corey, what exactly do you think is coming?" "Same thing that came to Memphis. Same thing that came to Baton Rouge and Tulsa and Salt Lake. It moves east to west. Population centers first, then it bleeds out along the highways. We're on Route 9 and we're 60 miles from I-90. Math says we have days, not weeks." "Math? Pattern. I've been watching the maps." Gary set his cracker down. "You've been watching the maps while you pour concrete. I can do 2 things. That night, I heard the first sounds that didn't belong to the world I knew. Not from the road, from the Caldwell property. A low, arrhythmic moaning that carried across the open ground like a sound from the bottom of a well. I stood on my porch with a flashlight and couldn't see anything. The sound continued for 20 minutes, then stopped. In the morning, I walked the fence line and found a woman in a hospital gown, face down, in Ed Caldwell's irrigation ditch. She was dead in the way things used to stay dead. She'd been walking and her body had simply quit. No bites that I could see, just exhaustion and exposure and whatever Gaines syndrome does to a body before it finishes the job. I buried her in the soft ground near the ditch. I didn't know her name. I still don't. When I came back, Gary was standing by the pit, and he didn't ask where I'd been. But he worked faster after that. By Friday evening, the main corridor walls were poured and the rebar skeleton of the sleeping chamber was in place. I was on schedule. The schedule lived in a spiral notebook I kept in my back pocket, every task listed in half-day blocks, with dependencies mapped out in a system only I understood. Gary called it the Bible. He wasn't entirely wrong. It was the only document I trusted, and I followed it with a faith that was, in retrospect, a way of not thinking about anything else. Friday night, a truck pulled off Route 9 and into my driveway. 2 men and a woman. The truck was a late model Ford with Oregon plates and a cracked windshield. The driver, a heavy man in a hunting jacket, walked toward my porch while I stood in the light holding nothing in particular. "We need gas," he said. "We'll pay." "I don't have gas to spare." "We can see the tank." He pointed to the 250-gallon diesel tank I kept for equipment. It was 3/4 full. "That's for the mixer. I need every gallon." He looked past me at the pit, the rebar, the mixer still warm from the last pour. "What are you building?" "Nothing that helps you." The woman in the truck said something I couldn't hear. The man stared at me for a long time, then got back in the Ford and pulled away. No threats, no confrontation, just a long look that contained an accurate understanding of what I was choosing, delivered without words. That was the first face. I catalogued it without meaning to. The heavy man in the hunting jacket who needed 30 gallons of diesel to keep his family moving west. I could have given it to him. I had enough. The schedule said I didn't, but the schedule was built on assumptions about how many pours I'd need, and assumptions are not facts. I chose the schedule. I chose the concrete. Saturday, the second convoy came through, and this one was different. The first convoy had been civilians self-organizing, families, loners, people with plans or the illusion of plans. The second convoy was what happens when the first convoy hits a wall. Vehicles coming back east on Route 9 because I-90 westbound was closed. The guard checkpoint had collapsed, which could mean a dozen things, and none of them good. The traffic reversed direction, and now people who'd driven 6 hours west were driving 6 hours east, looking for any option that wasn't the highway. Some of them stopped, not to ask for gas this time, to ask what I was building and whether there was room. A woman named Dana Pullman was the first to say it directly. She was maybe 35, driving a Subaru with a cracked taillight and a 7-year-old boy named Micah asleep in the back seat. She'd been a veterinary technician in Bozeman. She stood at the edge of my pit and watched Gary and me set forms for the storage room and said, "I can work. I'll do whatever you need. Just let us stay." "It's not finished," I said. "It's not livable." "When it is." I looked at her. I looked at the Subaru, at the sleeping kid, at the way her hands were trembling, even though her voice was steady. I thought about the spiral notebook. 6 people. The bunker was designed for 6, based on air volume, water storage, and the caloric load I'd calculated from military field manuals I'd found online 3 years ago, when this was still a hobby. I was 1. Gary was 2. That left 4 slots, and I'd been holding them in my mind for people I hadn't named yet, because naming them would make the math feel like choosing. "Can you mix concrete?" I asked. "I can learn in 10 minutes. You start now. You and the boy sleep in my house tonight. When the bunker's done, we'll talk about capacity." That was the second deal. Dana and Micah became workers, then occupants, then something I couldn't easily dismiss when the time came to close the door. She learned the mixer in 8 minutes. She was precise and fast, and she never asked me the same question twice. Sunday, I lost Gary. Not to the infection, not to violence. His daughter called on the last cell signal any of us would receive, and whatever she said made Gary set down his tools and look at me with an expression I recognized from my own divorce. The face of someone who's been asked to choose between 2 loyalties and knows that choosing is the same as losing. "She's alone," he said. "Her husband took the kids to his parents in Idaho and left her." "Gary, Missoula is 100 miles through whatever's happening on those roads." "I know. I can't go with you. I can't stop the build." "I'm not asking you to." He took off his work gloves and set them on the tailgate of his truck. "You've got Dana. She's better at the mixer than I am anyway." "That's not the point." The point is, my daughter is alone, and I'm standing in a hole. He left at noon. I gave him 40 gallons of diesel from the tank, the same 40 gallons I'd refused the man from Oregon 2 days earlier. I don't have a justification for that discrepancy that survives examination, so I won't offer one. Gary shook my hand and told me the walls looked good, and drove north on Route 9 at a speed that suggested he already knew he wouldn't make it, but was going to try it with the engine he had. I never heard from Gary again. By Sunday evening, the storage room was poured and curing, the sleeping chamber walls were up, and I was fabricating the hatch frame from the grain bin steel while Dana ran a bead of waterproofing sealant along the corridor joints. Micah sat on the edge of the pit, eating a granola bar, and watching us with the absolute unworried focus of a child who trusts that adults know what they're doing. Route 9 had gone quiet, not gradually, all at once, like someone had turned off a faucet. No headlights, no engines, no horns. Just the wind across 3 acres of Montana clay and the sound of my angle grinder cutting steel. The silence was worse than the convoys. The convoys meant people were still moving, still making decisions, still somewhere on a road that led to somewhere else. Silence meant the road had stopped being useful. Silence meant whatever was coming had arrived at the places people were running to. And the running was over. Monday morning, I saw my first walking dead. 3 of them, coming up the shallow draw that runs along the eastern edge of my property from the direction of the Caldwell Ranch. They moved the way the footage always showed. That wrong cadence walk that looks almost normal until your brain registers what's missing. No arm swing, no compensatory balance, no micro adjustments. Like a body being driven by someone who'd read the manual but never practiced. Dana saw them before I did. She was hauling a bucket of mixed concrete across the yard, and she stopped mid-stride and said, very quietly, "Corey." Micah was inside the house. I'd told him to stay inside when we were working, and he listened. He was a listener. 7 years old and already tuned to the frequency that says, when adults use that voice, you don't argue. I set down the steel plate I was cutting and picked up the 20-gauge shotgun I'd been keeping on the tailgate since Thursday. Not because I'm a tough man, because I'm a man with one entrance to defend and a weapon I've used to shoot coyotes off my property for 15 years. The 3 of them came up the draw in a loose triangle. 2 men and a woman. The men wore the kind of clothes you'd see on highway workers. The woman was barefoot and wearing one sleeve of a jacket, the other arm bare and discolored in a way I won't describe, because what matters isn't what they looked like. What matters is the sound. A dry, continuous, aspirated moan, like air being pushed through a throat that no longer knew how to stop pushing. Not loud, persistent. The way a refrigerator hums, you stop hearing it until you listen, and then you can't hear anything else. They were 400 yards out, then 300. I raised the shotgun, and Dana said, "Wait." "For what?" "They're not coming toward us. Watch." She was right. The triangle drifted south, following the draw's natural contour, angling across my property toward Route 9. They weren't tracking us. They were tracking the road, the last direction the traffic had gone. I lowered the shotgun. We watched them pass. It took 12 minutes. When they were gone, Dana set down the bucket, and I saw that her hands weren't shaking. They'd been shaking since she arrived. Now they were still. "How many do you think are behind them?" she asked. "I don't know." "Enough to make the hatch matter?" "Enough to make every hour matter." We went back to work. I didn't tell Dana that my hands were shaking now. The footage on television is a screen. 3 figures moving across your own land in the early light is the world confirming it's not going to go back to what it was. And your body knows this before your brain finishes the sentence. By Monday afternoon, the hatch frame was welded, and I'd begun mounting the hinge assembly. The hatch itself was a 1/4-inch steel plate, 3 feet by 3 feet. With a flush mount lock I'd machined from a deadbolt housing and a piece of square steel tubing. When closed from inside, the hatch would seat into a concrete lip with a 2-inch overlap on all sides. No handle on the outside. No visible seam from above. I'd pour a thin cap of concrete over the top and scatter dirt and grass seed. In 2 weeks, or 6 months, however long the grass took, the entrance would be invisible. That was the design. Invisible, impenetrable, a hole in the ground that the world couldn't find and couldn't open. Dana watched me test the hinge and said, "You've thought about this a long time. 3 years. Before any of this. Before any of this." She was quiet for a moment. "Who were the 6 slots for, originally?" I didn't answer because the answer was embarrassing. 2 for me. 1 for a woman I hadn't met yet. 3 for the children I thought I might have if I met her. A family I built a shelter for before I built the family. Karen would have laughed. Karen would have said this is exactly why she left. Because I built structures instead of relationships and called it love. She wouldn't have been wrong. Tuesday, I made the hatch operational and started fitting the ventilation system. A series of 4-inch PVC pipes running from the shelter through 12 feet of earth to surface vents disguised as irrigation standpipes. The vents had mesh screens and 90-degree elbows to prevent rain intrusion, and more importantly, to prevent anything from reaching down and blocking the airflow. I designed it so no single vent was critical. Lose 1, you're fine. Lose 2, you're uncomfortable. Lose 3, you've got 8 hours to fix the problem before CO2 buildup becomes dangerous. I was on my back in the corridor threading PVC when Dana came down the ladder and said, "There's a man at the property line. He's been watching us for an hour." I climbed out. The man was standing just beyond the fence line on the Caldwell side, near the irrigation ditch where I'd buried the woman in the hospital gown 5 days earlier. He was tall, wearing a canvas jacket and carrying a hunting rifle slung over one shoulder. Behind him, maybe 50 yards back, I could see 2 more figures sitting in a parked ATV. I walked to the fence. He didn't move. "Corey Brandt," he said. "Who's asking?" "Ray Jessup. I ranch the Tillman property north of here. I know what you're building. I've been watching the excavation from the ridge." My stomach dropped. The ridge. A 1/4 mile north, maybe 300 feet of elevation above my property. Clear sight line to my backyard, to the pit, to every pour and every weld and every hour of work I'd done in the open. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said. "Then what are you looking for?" "Partnership. I've got 12 people at my place, family and hands. We've got food stores, weapons, generator fuel. What we don't have is a hardened shelter. You do, or you're about to. It's built for 6. 6 is a starting point. You've got the skills to expand. I've got the labor and the supplies. Expansion takes time. Time I'm using to finish what I have." Ray Jessup looked past me at the pit, at the hatch frame glinting in the sun, at the PVC pipes laid out in the yard like white bones. "How long until you seal it?" 3 days, maybe 4. That's 3 days my 12 people are in a ranch house with wood frame walls and single-pane windows. You saw what came through the draw yesterday. I've seen more. A group of 9 on the Tillman Road last night. They're not organized, but they don't need to be. Enough of them against a window, and the window loses. I understand your situation. I don't think you do. I'm asking nicely because I'm a nice man. I won't always be a nice man. The 2 figures by the ATV hadn't moved. I couldn't tell if they were armed from this distance, but the rifle on Ray's shoulder answered the question for the group. "I need to think about it," I said. "Think fast. The weather's turning and whatever's on the highway is spreading into the valleys. You've got maybe a week before this area is unlivable above ground." He walked back to the ATV. The three of them drove north along the ridgeline and disappeared over the crest. I stood at the fence for a long time. Then I went back to threading PVC, because the PVC didn't ask me questions I couldn't answer. And the schedule didn't have a line item for negotiating with armed neighbors who'd been watching me from elevation for days. Dana was waiting in the corridor. What did he want? Same as everyone. He's not the same as everyone. He knows where we are, and he has guns. I know. Corey, 6 people in a sealed box is safe. 6 people in a sealed box with an armed group topside who knows exactly where the entrance is and is angry you didn't let them in. That's not safe. That's a coffin. She was right. The bunker's invisibility was its primary defense, and Ray Jessup had just removed it. Everything I'd built in 7 days, the concealed hatch, the disguised vents, the careful absence of any visible structure, was rendered theoretical by a man with binoculars on a ridge. Wednesday, I made the call I'd been avoiding since before the first convoy left. I'd been carrying Dean's number in my phone since 2019, when he'd called to tell me Karen was dating someone, and maybe I should know. I hadn't called him since the divorce. He'd sided with Karen. He'd told our mother I was difficult. He'd skipped my birthday 2 years running. The distance between us was the kind that families maintain by pretending it's temporary. Just a phase, just a rough patch. We'll get around to fixing it. Until enough time passes that the distance becomes the relationship. Dean lived in Spokane with his wife Carrie and their 2 kids, Peter and Annalise. Peter was 12. Annalise was 9. I'd met Annalise once at a Thanksgiving dinner in 2020 that lasted 4 hours and contained approximately 11 minutes of genuine conversation. The cell signal was gone, but my landline still worked. Hardwired copper running to the Ridgemont Exchange, the kind of infrastructure that outlasts everything built after it. I dialed Dean's number and got nothing. Dialed again. Nothing. Tried Carrie's cell, which was useless over a landline. Tried Dean's office number in Spokane. A recording told me all circuits were busy. I hung up and stood in my kitchen and looked at the spiral notebook. Day 9. The schedule said, finish ventilation, install water filtration, begin food and supply staging. The schedule did not say, call your brother. The schedule had never said call your brother, because the schedule was a document about concrete and steel and survival math. And Dean was a variable I'd excluded from the equation 3 years ago when I'd drawn the first sketches. 6 slots. I'd built the bunker for 6 people, and I'd never once penciled in Dean's name. Now I couldn't reach him. And I didn't know if that meant he'd evacuated safely or that the roads out of Spokane had become the same kind of footage I'd watched from Memphis. I stood in my kitchen, and I felt the shape of it. The possibility that my brother was somewhere between Spokane and anywhere, with his wife and his children, in a car that was running out of gas or stuck in traffic or stopped on a road that had stopped being a road. And I felt something else. The faintest, most corrosive thought, surfacing like a bubble in wet concrete. If Dean didn't come, the math worked. 6 slots, me, Dana, Micah. 3 remaining. Clean numbers. No negotiation. I went back to the bunker and worked until midnight. Thursday morning, Dana found me asleep in the corridor with a PVC coupling in my hand and said, "You're going to kill yourself before you finish saving yourself. I need 2 more days. You need sleep, and you need to deal with the Jessup problem. He came back last night." What? Around 2 a.m. ATV on the ridge. Headlights off. Sat there for 20 minutes, then left. I watched from the upstairs window. Ray Jessup was surveilling us. Not approaching, not threatening, just watching, measuring. A rancher's patience applied to a rancher's calculation. When is the right time to make a move on a resource someone else controls? We need to accelerate, I said. We need allies. Allies are capacity. Capacity is math. The math doesn't. The math is going to get us killed, Corey. You built something nobody can break into. Congratulations. You also built something nobody can defend from outside. And the outside is where Jessup's people are standing. She was right again. Dana had an inconvenient habit of being right about the things I'd built the schedule to avoid thinking about. The bunker was perfect underground and defenseless above. A hatch in the earth, no matter how thick, is only as safe as the ground around it. If Jessup wanted to, he could park a truck on the hatch. He could pile debris on the vents. He could simply wait. I'd spent 9 days building a structure that couldn't be broken into, and hadn't spent 9 minutes thinking about what happened when someone decided not to break in, but to sit on top of it. Thursday afternoon, I drove to the Jessup ranch. Dana told me not to go alone. I told her someone needed to stay with Micah. The truth was simpler. I needed to see what 12 people in a wood frame ranch house looked like after 10 days of collapse, because I needed to understand what I was being asked to absorb or refuse. The Tillman property was 4 miles north on a gravel access road. Ray's ATV tracks were fresh in the mud. The ranch house was a single-story 1960s build. White paint over wood siding, metal roof, a wraparound porch that sagged on the east end. 2 outbuildings, an equipment barn, and a hay shed. A diesel generator humming behind the barn. 6 vehicles parked in the yard. Ray met me on the porch. He was calmer than at the fence, calmer in the way people are when they think they're about to get what they want. "Come in," he said. Inside, I counted. 12 was accurate. Ray and his wife Linda. Their adult son Cole, maybe 25, with the same lean face and the same rifle. A family of 4 I didn't know. Man, woman, 2 teenage boys, who Ray introduced as the Marshalls, neighbors from the next valley who'd come when their property was overrun. And 4 ranch hands, 2 men and 2 women, names I recorded in the notebook as Thomas, Beck, Adrian, and June. They were organized. The house was clean. Food was rationed and tracked on a whiteboard in the kitchen. Weapons were stored in a locked room. Water came from a well with a hand pump backup. These were not desperate people. They were competent, provisioned, and frightened. And the combination made them more dangerous than any of those qualities alone. "Show me what you have," I said. "Everything." Ray walked me through it. 2,000 pounds of dry goods, 400 gallons of diesel, a medical kit that was better stocked than anything I had, ammunition, tools, seed stores, solar panels still in shipping boxes, never installed. "Why haven't you built your own shelter?" I asked. "We don't know how. Tried to reinforce the basement. It's a crawl space, not a bunker. 3 feet of clearance. You can't live in it, and you can't seal it. We needed a concrete man." He looked at me. "We've needed a concrete man since day 1. You didn't approach until Monday. I was hoping you'd leave and we could use the hole." I appreciated the honesty. It was the kind of honesty that comes from strength, not vulnerability. And I filed it accordingly. "If I let your people into the shelter," I said, "I need 3 things. All your diesel, the medical kit, and the solar panels." "Done." "I'm not finished. The shelter holds 6 in current configuration. I can expand it, but expansion takes 5 days minimum, and I need labor. Your son and your hands work under my direction. No arguments, no modifications, no suggestions from people who haven't poured concrete. Done. And the guns stay above ground. Nobody brings a firearm into my shelter. Ray was quiet. Cole, standing behind him, shifted his weight. The guns stay above ground, I repeated. That's a hard ask, Corey. It's not an ask. More silence. Then Linda, from the kitchen doorway. Ray, say yes. He said yes. We shook hands. I drove home and sat in my truck in the driveway for 10 minutes, running the numbers in the notebook. 18 people. The bunker I designed for 6 now needed to house 18. And the math, the oxygen math, the water math, the caloric math, the space per body math, screamed at me from every line on the page. But the diesel would let me run the mixer for 3 more weeks. The labor would let me dig lateral extensions. And the solar panels, if I could rig them to charge a battery bank vented to the surface, would give us power underground for months. I started a new page in the notebook. Across the top I wrote, Expansion Phase. Below it, in smaller letters, I wrote the only honest sentence in the entire document. I don't know if this works. Friday, the Jessup crew arrived at dawn. All 12 of them in 4 vehicles, loaded with everything Ray had promised, plus things I hadn't asked for. Lumber, hardware cloth, a gas-powered concrete saw that must have cost $4,000 new. Cole drove a flatbed carrying the solar panels, still boxed, pristine. A fragment of the old supply chain delivered into the new world. I put them to work immediately. Cole and the 2 younger ranch hands, Tomas and Beck, on excavation. The lateral extension would run south from the main corridor, creating a second sleeping chamber and a common room. 15 feet of additional tunnel, 8 feet wide, shored with lumber and then formed for a concrete pour. 5 days was optimistic. 7 was realistic. 10 was what the schedule would actually need, but I wrote 5 because morale is a variable and concrete is not. The marshals worked the surface. The father, Greg, and his 2 teenage sons hauled and mixed, while his wife, Nell, organized the supply transfer with Dana. Nell was quiet and precise, and had a way of inventorying canned goods that suggested she'd worked retail, which she had, 18 years at a feed store in Ennis. She and Dana developed a shorthand within 2 hours that eliminated the need for me to manage logistics. I let them have it. Control is only useful if it serves the build. Ray stayed above ground with his rifle. He and Linda and Adrian and June established a perimeter watch, rotating in 6-hour shifts, covering the approaches from Route 9, the Caldwell Draw, and the Ridge. For the first time since I'd started digging, I wasn't watching the horizon while I worked. Someone else was doing it. And the relief was physical. A knot between my shoulder blades that I hadn't known was there until it released. The dead came twice that day. Once from the south, a pair stumbling up Route 9 in the late morning. Ray watched them through his scope and let them pass. They drifted west into the fields and disappeared. Once from the east at dusk, a single figure moving through the tree line along the Caldwell fence line. Cole shot it from the ridge. The sound carried, and nobody spoke for a few minutes afterward. The first shot anyone had fired on my property. It changed the air. Not the safety, the air. By Friday night, the lateral extension was excavated and the first forms were set. Cole worked harder than anyone I've ever employed, including myself. He didn't talk while he worked. He just moved dirt with a focus that I recognized because it was mine. The focus of a man who has decided that the physical task is the entire world, and the world outside the task doesn't exist until the task is done. After dark, I found Dana sitting on the porch steps with Micah asleep in her lap. She was looking at the sky. No light pollution anymore. The stars were obscene in their clarity. 18 people, she said. I know. The ventilation system was designed for 6. I'll add vents. The PVC stock is adequate. And the water filtration? 1 filter serves 20 per the manufacturer. We're inside the margin. The margin for what? Comfortable survival, or we don't die this week? The second one. She looked at me. You know what you're building isn't a bunker anymore, right? It's a town. A tiny, underground, airless town. And you're the mayor because you poured the walls. I'm not the mayor. I'm the contractor. The contractor decides who gets to live inside the building. What do you think a mayor does? I didn't answer. I went back to the shelter and worked on the ventilation expansion until 2 in the morning, alone in the corridor with a headlamp and a hacksaw and the notebook open to a page of numbers that kept not adding up no matter how many times I ran them. Sunday I got the call. Not on the cell network, which had been dead for days. On the landline. Copper wire and a connection that routed through the Ridgemont exchange, which was still running on backup power that no one was maintaining and would fail when it failed. The phone rang at 6 in the morning. I was in the kitchen making coffee on the camp stove because the power grid had dropped 2 days earlier. The ring was so ordinary, so completely from the old world, that I stared at the phone for 3 full rings before picking it up. Corey. Dean's voice, strained and compressed, like he was speaking through a pipe. Corey, are you there? I'm here. Thank God, thank God. We've been trying, every number, listen. We're on Route 200, east of Missoula. We left Spokane 4 days ago. The interstate is gone. We've been taking back roads. Are you okay? Carrie and the kids. We're okay. We're okay. Corey, I'm not just... We picked up people on the way. I couldn't just drive past them. You understand? My hand tightened on the phone. How many people, Dean? Silence. The line crackled with the static of infrastructure in its death rattle. 11, he said, counting us. 11 total. I closed my eyes. 11. Dean and Carrie and Peter and Annalise made 4. That meant 7 strangers. 7 people my brother had collected on the road between Spokane and Montana, because Dean has always been the one who stops. Dean has always been the one who pulls over. It's why Karen liked him. It's why everyone likes Dean and merely tolerates Corey. Because Dean is the brother who opens his hands, and Corey is the brother who pours walls. How far are you? Maybe 6 hours. The roads are bad. We had to backtrack twice. Corey, I know this is a lot. But you have the land, and you're the only person I know who would still be there. Everyone else ran. You didn't run, did you? No. I knew it, I told Carrie. I said Corey didn't run. He's there, and he's building something, because that's what Corey does. I looked at the notebook. 18 people already committed. The expansion pour was half done. The shelter, at full extension, could hold. I ran the numbers in my head, standing in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear. 22. Maybe 24 if we stacked sleeping in shifts, which we'd have to. 29. Dean's 11 would make 29. Corey, you still there? I'm here. Route 200 to Route 9 south. You'll see the property on the left. 3 acres, brown house, equipment in the yard. We'll be there tonight, Corey. Thank you. Drive fast. Don't stop for anyone else. I hung up. I stood in the kitchen. Then I went outside and told Dana, who looked at me with an expression that was not surprise, but was something worse. Recognition. She recognized the shape of what was happening because she'd seen it before. in the Subaru on the side of Route 9 a week ago, when she'd stood at the edge of my pit and asked to stay. Every person who arrives changes the calculation. Every changed calculation erodes the margin. Every eroded margin brings the bunker closer to the thing it was designed to prevent. A space where survival becomes impossible. I went down into the corridor and stared at the walls. My walls. 22 years of concrete work, every technique I'd ever learned, every pour I'd ever done, all of it compressed into this one structure in this one hole in the ground. The walls were good, plumb and true and strong. They would hold. They just weren't big enough. And no amount of time or skill could make them big enough for what was coming. Because what was coming wasn't the dead. What was coming was everyone my brother couldn't leave behind on the road. They arrived at 9:30 that night. Not in one vehicle, in 3. Dean's Tahoe in the lead, followed by a white minivan and a sedan with a missing bumper. Headlights off, moving by moonlight up Route 9, which would have been smart if Ray's perimeter watch hadn't already spotted them at half a mile and put everyone on alert. I met them in the driveway with a flashlight. Dean got out of the Tahoe and hugged me, and I let him. And the hug was strange, because it contained both the distance of 6 years and the compression of the last 12 days. And those two things don't fit in the same embrace. He was thinner. His beard was growing and patchy. Carrie emerged from the passenger side, looking like she'd been awake for 4 days, which she probably had. Peter and Annalise climbed out of the back seat and stood in the dark like passengers arriving at the wrong terminal. Then the others. From the minivan, a couple in their 60s, Frank and Maria Sperza, retired teachers from Coeur d'Alene who'd been stuck at a gas station when Dean found them. A young man, maybe 22, named Kenji, who said almost nothing and carried a backpack he never set down. From the sedan, a woman named Holly with her arm in a makeshift sling. And 2 men I learned were brothers, Sam and Tucker Whitfield, from a town east of Spokane I'd never heard of. They'd been walking when Dean picked them up. 7 strangers, 11 bodies, 29 total. I looked at Dean and said, "Inside." In my kitchen, with everyone standing because there weren't enough chairs, I laid it out. The bunker, the capacity, the expansion underway, but unfinished. The Jessup group already committed. The math. 29 is not possible, I said. Not in the current structure, not in the expansion. The oxygen calculus fails at 26. The water filtration fails before that. We'd be sealing ourselves into a space that kills us slower than the surface, which is not survival. It's choosing your cause of death. The room was quiet. Dean said, "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I can take you and your family, 4 more. That puts us at 22, which is the hard ceiling. And the others? I can give them supplies. I can give them the house. It's defensible enough for short-term shelter. I can give them. Corey." Dean's voice was flat. "I drove 4 days to get here. I picked these people up because they were dying on the road. I'm not going to sit in a hole in the ground while they sit in your living room waiting for the walls to cave in. Then help me find another option. Expand it more. There's no time. Ray Jessup has been watching from the ridge, and 2 nights ago, his son shot a dead man on our fence line. The infection is in the valley. We have maybe 72 hours before this property is not defensible from above ground." Holly, the woman with the sling, spoke from the back of the room. "How much expansion would you need?" "For 29. Another 30 feet of lateral corridor, a 3rd chamber, triple the ventilation. 14 days of work. We don't have 14 hours. You have 29 pairs of hands." I looked at her. She was maybe 40, and despite the sling, Her eyes were the steadiest thing in the room. "I'm a structural engineer," she said. "I worked for FEMA for 6 years before I went private. I've certified shelters. I've also condemned them. Let me see what you have." I took Holly into the bunker with a flashlight. She moved through the corridor with her good hand on the wall, reading the concrete the way I read it. With touch, with pressure, with the practiced awareness of someone who understands that a wall is not a surface, but a statement about load. She checked the rebar spacing through the forms. She looked at the ventilation layout. She examined the hatch. When we climbed out, she said, "Your pour work is excellent. Your capacity estimate is wrong." "Excuse me?" "You calculated for continuous occupancy. Everyone underground, 24 hours a day. That's a submarine model. It's the wrong model. You have a surface property with structures. You have an armed perimeter. The bunker isn't a home. It's a panic room. You surface during safe hours. You descend during threat hours. Occupancy rotates. You don't need to fit 29 people in here simultaneously. You need to fit 29 people in here for the worst 8 hours of any given day." I stared at her. 3 years of design work, 11 days of construction, and a woman with a broken arm had just restructured my entire concept in 60 seconds. "Rotating occupancy changes the oxygen math," I said slowly. "It changes everything. You need more bunks, less air. The ventilation you have handles 29 on a 12-hour cycle with passive venting during off hours. You need more storage and a faster ingress-egress system. That hatch is a bottleneck for 29 bodies in a hurry. I can widen it. You can widen it tomorrow. Tonight, you can accept that what you built is enough if you stop trying to seal everyone inside it permanently." The idea hit me in a way that was physical. I'd spent 11 days building a sealed box. Every decision I'd made, the concealed hatch, the narrow entrance, the impenetrable walls, was oriented around the concept of total closure. A world underground, complete and independent, needing nothing from the surface. That was the design. That was the 3-year dream. And Holly was telling me the dream was wrong. Not the construction, the philosophy. The bunker didn't need to be a world. It needed to be a room. A room you retreat to when the worst arrives, and leave when the worst passes. A room connected to the surface, not severed from it. I sat down on the edge of the pit and felt something shift inside my chest that I can only describe as a wall moving. Not falling, moving. Settling into a new position, still structural, still load-bearing, but oriented differently, letting something through that it had been designed to stop. Monday was the longest day. At dawn, I had 29 people on my property, and a plan I'd rebuilt overnight on a legal pad, with Holly's one-handed annotations in red ink. Rotating occupancy, expanded hatch. Secondary egress. A narrow escape tunnel punched south from the storage room. 10 feet of hand-dug passage ending at a concealed exit in the hillside. Not pretty, not engineered. A dirt tunnel with plywood shoring and a prayer. But a second way out, which meant the bunker was no longer a sealed box. It was a structure with options. Cole and Thomas and Beck worked excavation on the escape tunnel. Dean and the Whitfield brothers mixed concrete for the hatch expansion. Greg Marshall and his boys ran PVC for additional ventilation. Frank Esperza, who was 71 and had a bad hip, sat on a folding chair with Ray's rifle and watched the eastern approach because Ray said anyone who can sit still for 6 hours is a qualified sentry. I worked the concrete. I poured and I set and I finished, and I moved to the next section. And for 12 hours, I didn't think about capacity or oxygen or the notebook. I just worked. 22 years of muscle memory flowing through my hands into the forms. The wet gray material taking the shape I told it to take, because that's what concrete does. It obeys the form. It becomes what you build it to become. It is the most honest material in the world because it never pretends to be something it's not. At 4 in the afternoon, while I was smoothing the expanded hatch seat, Ray called from the ridge. He'd been watching Route 9 through his scope. "Corey, you need to see this." I climbed the slope to his position and took the scope. South on Route 9, maybe 2 miles out, a column. Not vehicles, bodies. Walking dead, moving north along the highway in a loose mass that stretched back far enough that the road's curve hid the end of it. 30, 50. I couldn't count accurately because they merged at distance. But it was more than I'd seen, more than anyone here had seen. "They're following the road," Ray said. "Same as before. Before was 3, before was 9. That's not 9, Corey." "No." "How long until they reach the property line?" "At that speed? 4 hours, maybe 5. "And if they turn?" "Then we find out if the bunker works." I went back to the site. I didn't announce what I'd seen. I told Holly and Dana and Ray, and the 4 of us made a decision without a vote. Accelerate the timeline. Everything that could be finished in 4 hours would be finished. Everything that couldn't would be abandoned. The escape tunnel was 8 feet done, not 10. We shored it with plywood and called it complete. And I hated the number 8 because it wasn't 10. And the 2 feet of difference was the kind of margin that kills people when margins are what you're living on. The hatch expansion was done. The secondary ventilation was in. The supply staging, water, food, medical, batteries, the Jessup diesel, was as organized as it was going to get, thanks to Dana and Nell, and a system of labeled bins that would have impressed a warehouse manager. At 6 p.m., I stood in the yard with 28 people and the sun going down, and the sound of the generator, and underneath it, something else. Something I couldn't identify until I stopped the generator and listened. The moaning. The same dry, continuous, aspirated sound I'd heard from the Caldwell draw 10 days ago, but multiplied and merged into a single low chord that rolled across the valley like weather. "Everybody in," I said. And this is where the story breaks from the plan, because the plan assumed order. The plan assumed people would descend the ladder in sequence, move to their assigned areas, and settle. The plan did not account for the sound of 50 or 70 or 100 dead voices carried on a Montana evening, or for the panic that sound produces in people who have been holding themselves together for 12 days on adrenaline and structure and are now hearing the thing they've been running from announce itself across the valley. The hatch was a bottleneck. Even widened, even optimized, it took 90 seconds per person to descend the ladder into the corridor. 29 people times 90 seconds is 43 minutes. 43 minutes of standing in my backyard, in the open, with the sound growing louder and the light fading, and nothing between us and the road except 3 acres of flat Montana clay. Holly directed the descent. She stood at the hatch and called names from the list she'd written. Children first, then injured, then elderly, then everyone else. And her voice was steady and clear. And I understood in that moment that I was not the most important person on my own property. I had built the structure. Holly was operating it. The marshals went down, then Frank and Marie, then Micah, carried by Dana. Then Carrie and the kids, with Dean staying topside because Dean stays topside. Then Kenji and the Whitfield brothers, and June and Adrian and Beck and Tomas. Ray and Cole went last, handing the rifles to me before they descended. Guns stay above ground. That was the deal. Cole looked at me as he handed over his weapon and said the first full sentence I'd heard from him in 3 days. "Don't die up here being stubborn." I stood in my yard with 2 rifles and a flashlight, and listened to 28 people settling into a space I'd designed for 6, revised for 22, and was now holding 29. The math had been wrong from the beginning, not the concrete math, the human math. I'd built for a number, and people don't come in numbers. They come in families and strangers and brothers who can't drive past someone on the road. Dean was still beside me. He hadn't gone down. "Go," I said. "Not without you." "Someone has to close the hatch from above and cover it. Then I'll close it. You don't know the seal mechanism. Then show me." I looked at my brother. 6 years of silence. 6 years of choosing distance and calling it principle. He'd driven 4 days through the end of the world and brought me 7 strangers because he couldn't do what I do, which is drive past people, and I couldn't do what he does, which is stop. "We go together," I said. "I'll seal it from inside, the hatch seats from below." I descended. Dean followed. I pulled the hatch closed and engaged the flush mount lock and felt the concrete lip seat against the steel and heard the sound of my own design completing itself. The mechanical perfection of a 1/4-inch plate settling into a 2-inch overlap. Airtight, invisible, impenetrable. 29 people in a hole in the ground. Breathing. The first night underground with 29 bodies is not something the notebook prepared me for. The air was warm. 29 people generate heat, and the ventilation system I designed for 6, then 12, then 22, was working at a capacity that turned the corridor into something between a subway car and a sleeping bag. Humidity fogged the flashlight beams. The concrete walls, which I'd been proud of for their smooth finish, wept condensation within 2 hours. We arranged ourselves by necessity, not comfort. The main sleeping chamber held the children and their parents, Micah and Dana, Peter and Annalise and Carrie, the Marshall boys. The expansion chamber held the Jessup crew and the Aspertzas. The corridor itself became a sleeping space for everyone else. Bodies laid head to foot along the floor on sleeping pads and folded blankets. Holly had calculated the air volume at 17 cubic feet per person per hour, which she said was adequate for 12 hours and dangerous at 18. The plan was to surface at dawn, weather permitting. Weather meaning the dead. I sat with my back against the corridor wall near the hatch and listened. To the breathing, to the small sounds, shifting, coughing, a child whispering. And through it all, filtered through 12 feet of earth and a 1/4 inch of steel, the sound from above. Not individual voices, a pressure, a vibration that lived below hearing and registered in the chest and the teeth and the bones. They were on the property. How many, I couldn't know. Whether they'd found the hatch, I couldn't know. The hatch was concealed, sunk into a concrete lip and covered with a thin pore I'd dressed with dirt and grass cuttings. In daylight, it might pass. At night, to things that navigated by sound and whatever else they navigated by, I had no data. Dean sat down next to me. We hadn't been this close in years. "You built this," he said. "With help. You designed it. You dug the first hole. You poured the first wall. This is yours. It's not enough. Corey, we're alive. We're alive right now. Tomorrow the air tells us if we stay alive." He was quiet. Then, "I'm sorry about the last 6 years." "Don't. I need to. You don't need to do anything except breathe slowly and conserve oxygen." He laughed. It was the smallest laugh I've ever heard, almost inaudible, and it was the first time I'd heard my brother laugh in 6 years. And it happened in a concrete box 12 feet underground while the dead walked overhead. "You always do that," he said. "Turn everything into a task. Tasks I can solve. The other stuff I can't. The other stuff is why I'm here. I didn't drive 4 days for a bunker. I drove 4 days for my brother. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the concrete hadn't already said for me. I'd built a structure. He'd built a convoy. One of us was right, and the other was also right. And the space where those two kinds of rightness overlapped was exactly the size of the corridor we were sitting in. At dawn, Holly checked the ventilation readings. Temperature, humidity, a crude CO2 test she'd rigged from a candle in a jar, and declared the air survivable but deteriorating. Her recommendation was to surface immediately and vent the shelter for a minimum of 4 hours before reoccupying. I climbed the ladder and pressed my ear to the hatch. Nothing. No vibration, no pressure. I undid the lock, cracked the hatch 1 inch, and looked through the gap at an empty Montana morning. Gray sky, frost on the grass, my yard undisturbed except for the tracks. The tracks were everywhere. In the mud, in the frost, in the soft ground around the pit. Footprints with no rhythm, no direction, no pattern. They'd walked over the hatch. They'd walked around the house. They'd walked through the yard and out the other side and continued north on Route 9, because Route 9 was the path of least resistance, and the dead, whatever else they are, follow the path of least resistance. I opened the hatch fully. The air that hit me was cold and clean, and I breathed it so deeply that my vision went white at the edges. "Clear," I called down. 28 people climbed out of my bunker into the daylight, one at a time, blinking and stretching and breathing in a way that made the word breathing inadequate. It wasn't breathing. It was reclaiming the air, taking it back from the underground, from the compressed warmth, from the shared exhalation of 29 bodies in a space designed for 6. Micah came out holding Dana's hand and looked at the sky and said, "It smells different." "It smells like outside," Dana said. "No, it smells like it's still here." I don't know what a 7-year-old means when he says the outside smells like it's still here. I know it made Dana close her eyes for a moment. And I know it made me look at my property. The house, the yard, the equipment, the pit, the concealed hatch, the hills rising to the ridge where Ray had watched through his scope. And see it not as a construction site, but as a place where 29 people had just survived a night underground and come out to find the world still present, damaged, different, still here. The pattern established itself over the next 5 days. Surface during daylight, work on the shelter expansion, the secondary egress, the above-ground defenses that Ray and Cole were constructing from lumber and hardware cloth. Not walls, but obstacles, channeling anything that came up the draw away from the hatch area. Descend at dusk. Seal the hatch. Breathe together in the dark for 10 or 12 hours. Surface at dawn. The dead came through every night. Some nights a handful, some nights more. We never counted accurately because counting required observation, and observation required exposure. And the protocol was, everyone below ground before the light fails. No exceptions. The hatch seats at sunset and opens at dawn. Holly redesigned the ventilation on day 3. She and I cut new PVC runs on the surface during daylight hours, extending the vent network, and adding passive convection channels that drew air through the shelter continuously even when sealed. The CO2 readings improved. The humidity dropped. The condensation on the walls dried to a mineral residue that I scraped off during surface hours because the corridor walls were my walls, and I maintained them. By the 5th day, we had a rhythm, not comfort, rhythm. The Jessup crew handled perimeter and construction above ground. The Marshals handled supply management with Dana and Nell. Holly and I handled the shelter's structural integrity and its expansion, which was now 2 additional chambers cut south from the main corridor, shored and poured and curing. Dean organized the cooking. Surface meals only, never underground. Because fire consumes oxygen, and Holly would not negotiate on this. Even Kenji, the quiet young man with the backpack he never opened, found a role. He'd been a network technician before everything, and he rigged a battery-powered intercom between the shelter and the surface using components from the Jessup generator's control panel. 3 buttons: surface clear, surface compromised, descend now. On day 7 above the shelter, after the second expansion pour had cured and I was finishing the interior surface of the new common room, Dean found me alone underground. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Okay." I didn't take Karen's side. I took the side that let me keep talking to both of you. And it didn't work. I lost both of you anyway. I set down the finishing trowel. "Dean, let me finish. I spent 6 years thinking we'd fix it. I'd call you next month, next Christmas, next something. And then the world ended, and I realized there was no next anything. There was only right now, and whether I drove to Montana or didn't. You drove to Montana, with 11 people you didn't ask for. I didn't ask for any of this." I gestured at the walls, the corridor, the shelter I'd spent 3 years dreaming about and 12 days building. I asked for a hole in the ground that nobody could get into. That was the design. Impenetrable. Population, me. And instead? I'm standing in a common room I poured for 29 people, 6 of whom are named Jessup, and 7 of whom you collected on the highway because you stopped for everyone. You're angry. I'm not angry. I was angry. Now I looked for the word. Rebuilt. He waited. I built this bunker so nobody could break in. 1/4-inch steel, concrete walls, concealed hatch, invisible, impenetrable. And then you drove up with 11 people and a FEMA engineer with a broken arm. And she looked at my perfect sealed box and told me it was the wrong shape. Not the walls, the idea. The whole idea was wrong. What was the wrong part? The sealed part. I built a world underground that didn't need the surface. A closed system. Me and my concrete and my spiral notebook. And it turns out what I actually needed was a door that opens. In both directions. Every morning. Dean put his hand on the wall. My wall. His palm flat against the surface I'd finished that morning, the concrete still cool and slightly tacky with curing moisture. "It's smooth," he said. 22 years of practice. "It's good work, Corey." "I know." We stood there in the shelter I designed for one kind of survival and repurposed for another. Above us, through 12 feet of earth, I could hear the sounds of 27 people doing the work of being alive on a surface that tried to kill them every night. The generator running, a saw cutting lumber, a child's voice, Micah or Annalise, I couldn't tell, saying something I couldn't make out. And the wind, always the wind, carrying whatever it carried across 3 acres of Montana clay that I'd once thought of as the moon. Karen was right. It was the moon. I just hadn't understood that the moon could be populated, that you could pour walls on the moon, and people would come to live inside them, not because the walls were impenetrable, but because someone had bothered to build them at all. The bunker is still here. I'm still here. So are 26 of the 29. Marie Esperza died on day 14, quietly in the expansion chamber. Her heart. Frank buried her on the hillside where the secondary egress opens, and he sits there every morning before the day's work begins. He doesn't talk to her. He just sits. I poured a small slab over the grave so the ground would hold. Beck and Adrian left on day 20, heading south. They believed there was something organized in Wyoming. Maybe there is. I gave them diesel and canned goods and didn't try to stop them. The shelter has 5 chambers now. The hatch opens every morning and closes every night. Holly certified the ventilation for 32, which means we have margin for 3 more people. And I have stopped pretending that the margin won't be used. Someone will come up Route 9. Someone always comes up Route 9. And when they do, they'll find a man in a yard with concrete on his boots who spent 3 years designing a door that no one could open, and then spent the rest of his life learning to leave it unlocked. The spiral notebook is full. I started a new one. On the first page, where I once wrote the dimensions of a shelter for 6, I wrote 26 names. Not a capacity calculation, a roster. The difference between those 2 things is everything I failed to understand before the world explained it to me in a language I couldn't argue with. Concrete doesn't argue. It takes the shape of the form. I just finally built the right form.